on them to define and abide by and enforce those rules independent of the power of the state. Independent of the power of the state. That is going to be key. So why self-regulation for cybersecurity? I expect for this audience, a lot of this stuff you all have some understanding of. Let me see if I can push this a little further out. No, I don't want to break things. Okay, most critical infrastructure remains created and controlled by the private sector. We probably all know the apocryphal made up, probably about right, estimate that 85% of critical infrastructure is privately created, controlled, operated. The pace of innovation and development is hard for regulation and regulators to track. Kind of a pacing problem sort of situation. The visibility into cybersecurity incidents is largely, not exclusively, but largely controlled by the private sector. This is why, for instance, when we have Russian actors breaking into systems in Ukraine, Microsoft is called in to identify and address these situations. They're the first responders. This is why we have the Verizon data breach investigation report instead of the CISA data breach investigation report. We rely on the private sector just to know what's going on. Complexity of the systems, this is a variation of the pacing problems, but this is an expertise story. The folks who understand these systems are the folks developing them. Horse out of the barn, genie out of the bottle problem. A lot of these, the weaknesses in infrastructure, the vulnerabilities, we don't identify until after they're already in the wild. We identify 0 days, not because companies think, hey, let's design some 0 days into our software. That sounds like fun. No, we find them because it's hard to design these correctly. And it's not going to be until things are identified years later that we recognize we need to do something. And most important, perhaps, what should the rules be?
Before we answer that question,
yes,
I think people are in the waiting room.
Oh,
What I was told.
well, now we need to figure out where.
Okay.
I think the controls are on this screen. If you go back up to the top,
stop share.
No, you can just click participants. And attendees. Why are they?
They seem into
They seem in.
Okay.
I'd ask if anyone's in the waiting room, but that's like asking if you're not here, please raise your hand.
Right. They seem to be in here. Me, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I can get back.
Sorry.
Okay. Let's stop share. Get this going again. Go back here. That. Okay, back to the most important, hardest issue is we just don't know what the rules necessarily should be. And even if we did, how long would it take Congress to actually implement these rules or figure out which regulator has legal authority to implement those rules and implement them in a way that's going to survive judicial challenge? Boy, oh boy, let's wait 15 years before we've got some baseline cybersecurity rules. That ain't a good plan. So self-regulation avoids that problem. So some why for self-regulation of cybersecurity. Examples, pictures. So You all are probably generally familiar with a lot of these. The Common Vulnerability Scoring System. That's a self-regulatory-ish organization. That's a private organization that's come up with standards that are widely applied. Underwriters Laboratories, you all are probably somewhat familiar with them. Importantly, those are completely private. UL is not a government thing. A lot of people think that Underwriters Labs is a government thing. Private entity. It turns out the greatest reason that UL is so widely used, insurers, if your house burns down and it's because a fire started with a UL product, they're going to probably cover it. If a fire starts in your house and it's because a non-UL listed product shorts out, your insurance company might not cover it. So that's where we get some of those teeth there. The CE mark, anyone familiar with the CE mark? This is the European Union's standard certification for electronic equipment mark. They now have cybersecurity standards incorporated into that. MPEG, the standard setting organization that develops all of the compression algorithms for video and audio. That's a standard setting organization, but they enforce compliance in some ways with those standards. You need to be a member of the organization to use those standards. There are patent pools involved. That's a self-regulatory organization. Again, that's a private one. Trustee. Familiarity with trustee? Couple hands going up. This is a really interesting, again, privately created organization. Does a lot with privacy and children's privacy online. And one of the reasons that they are so interesting is in the late 90s, the FTC and European Union, they came up with the safe harbor standards for international data flows. And trustee was one of the certified, the government recognized safe harbor compliant certification organizations that if you were doing transatlantic data flows, you could say, we comply with the trustee privately created requirements. And the government would say, okay, good. You can engage in these data flows. You are compliant with the safe harbor. So we're starting to see government in there. And anyone know what the logo on the far right is? This is a new one. This is the US Cyber Trust Mark that the US government developed mostly through the FCC, has been working since 2022 to implement. And just this past summer, they started to implement this. So your IoT devices, you can throw this mark that no one recognizes or understands what means on it. And you are saying that you are compliant with, in this case, more government created standards. So some examples here. Couple more examples. Okay, as lawyers, future lawyers, the ABA, the AMA, American Medical Association, these are self-regulatory organizations. They are, to be a lawyer, to be a doctor, you need to be a member of a state bar. So there's much more legal oomph behind them, but we rely on a lot of professions to regulate themselves. That is a form of self-regulation, and various reasons for that. But the more interesting thing is, why is this so important and effective? Well, it's because people tend to trust their doctors. Don't know why they trust their lawyers, but they also tend to trust lawyers. So long as we are acting in the good of the public is willing to let us regulate ourselves. There are other stories that we can tell about this if we get into political theory, but the ABA is an example of self-regulation. FINRA, Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. This is probably the granddaddy example of self-regulation in the United States. If you are a licensed broker-dealer in the United States, you need to be a member of a self-regulatory organization that the SEC approves. FINRA is the largest of them, and they set standards for broker-dealers. They set rules, things that you need to do. They have enforcement capabilities. They can kick you out. And if you get kicked out of FINRA and can't find another financial SRO to be a member of, you can no longer be a broker-dealer in the United States. So there are real consequences there. And again, the government has some role in approving these. Better Business Bureau. Better Business Bureau national programs They are a meta self-regulatory organization. They actually run about 30 different self-regulation programs targeted mostly around advertising. So children's advertising targeting children or relating to children. They've got a self-regulation program there that you can become a member of. Laser pointer. Do I have a laser pointer? I don't know if I do. Okay, no laser pointer. Section 509, Online Family Empowerment Act. Title II of the Communications Act of 1934. Any idea what that statutory-ish text is there? Anyone see it and can shout out what that is? Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Big, important law, kind of going up to the Supreme Court, kind of a big issue right now. This is, we don't think of this typically as self-regulation, but this is self-regulation. What Section 230 says is basically online platforms, you get to regulate yourself. We are going to, so Congress passed this law, Section 230, that says platforms are not liable for any content that users upload to them, and they are free to moderate that content as they see fit. Idea in the 1990s was, hey, all you new internet companies, we trust that there are going to be market forces and competition and users leaving you, going to other platforms. If you're a bad steward of the online experience, if you decide that you're going to allow harmful speech, be a haven for hate speech, if you're going to allow content, neo-Nazi content on your website, the marketplace is going to say, that's bad. We're not going to give you advertising funding. Users are going to say, that's bad. We're going to leave you and go to Facebook because Mark Zuckerberg is better. So this creates an incentive, a market-based incentive, instead of a regulatory legal incentive for companies to self-regulate, to structure their business, adopt rules for the road, terms of service. This is the theory, at least, was the theory in the 1990s, in order to have a good online environment. So we're starting to see that the story about Section 230 isn't as rosy today as it was 25 years or so ago. We're starting to see some issues with self-regulation, which brings me to ASAF. And a clicker that is no longer working. Okay, so, but big screen full of text. This is a screenshot from a paper that ASAF has. You can see citation. He has a lawfare regulating commercial spyware, just highlighting or circling the key part. ASAF says there's a large body of literature now to explain when, why, how corporate self-regulation fails. Quoting another scholar, businesses cannot be relied on to regulate themselves except in various circumstances, because it turns out if there aren't strong enforcement things behind it, companies aren't going to comply. If there are adverse market incentives, companies are going to do bad things sometimes. So maybe we can't trust businesses to regulate themselves as much as the self-regulatory story would suggest. But with apologies to ASAF, we go and look into the cited literature. They're actually talking about a different sort of self-regulation. So this is one of the main papers ASAF cites, making self-regulation more than merely symbolic, the critical role of the legal environment. You'll see here, I'll stand up here, one common organizational response to these kinds of institutional pressures has been to adopt internal compliance structures such as grievance procedures and codes of conduct to demonstrate a commitment to comply with legal mandates or bring corporate conduct into line with widely shared normative ideals like workplace fairness and environmental sustainability. The existing literature provides a rich empirical and theoretical account of how and why these kinds of self-regulatory structures emerge and diffuse broadly across organizational fields. Most of this literature is about internal compliance, internal self-regulation. It isn't about industry-wide efforts. It isn't about groups of companies coming together and saying, these are the rules of the road by which we members of this organization agree to comply with. If you don't comply with these, you're out. We're kicking you out of our self-regulatory organization, or we're going to slap you with a fine because we've agreed to have that sort of authority. It turns out, first, I'm really interested in industry self-regulation, not internal self-regulation. So clarifying that, in case this is being recorded or anyone online or any of you don't get to the end of this talk, I actually really agree with Asaf. I'm going to end up, even though I'm framing this as a criticism, I'm going to end up agreeing with him. What is industry self-regulation? It has been, there's been a ton written on industry self-regulation. If you do a search on Westlaw, you will find thousands of articles that mention or discuss self-regulation, industry self-regulation at some level. Most of this work I'll come back to is very empirical, anecdotal. Here's an example of self-regulation. Let's talk about it. But there have been several characteristics of what makes self-regulation work. The top two are the most important ones, and then the second two are common things that we see. Most important things are the ability to set standards and the ability to meaningfully enforce those standards. For a self-regulatory organization to be a self-regulatory organization, it's not enough to say, hey, this is a stamp of approval that we're going to let companies slap on their products. There need to be some criteria underlying who gets to use that stamp of approval. And second, there needs to be some real consequences for when you don't. Now, sometimes these are mandatory, sometimes they're voluntary. The real difference between mandatory or voluntary is whether the government requires you to be a member of an SRO. So FINRA is a great example, the example of a mandatory SRO. Something like CBSS is a real example of this is just the standards. This isn't even a self-regulatory organization. There's no consequences surrounding it. Sometimes required or backed by the government. Sometimes the consequence will be a governmental slap on the wrist. Other times it will be the organization is in charge of policing its members. Virtues, a lot of this is intuitive. If you have thought about self-regulatory organizations, these will be very familiar. Virtues, they're better tailored, they're more adaptable to a complex industry. They're less burdensome both upon the industry gets rules that it likes, but also the government. That last bit is really important. Typically, the SROs are responsible for policing themselves. So it isn't the government agency that needs to be doing the audits, that needs to be policing the organization. We rely on the organization to police its members. And what the government does is it polices the organization. So if FINRA is doing a bad job of policing its members, the government complains to FINRA. FINRA risks losing its accreditation, not the individual members. Sometimes this is the only practical way to get rules in place. When's Congress going to adopt some privacy legislation? It's been right around the corner for the last 20 years or so. So that's why trustee, for instance, was very powerful, very widely used, especially they had some issues. Self-regulatory organizations aren't perfect a decade or so ago, but they can get rules in place where the government can't. And frequently we say that they allow the benefits of regulation while allowing for continued innovation. Regulation that goes through the government process, a notice and comment style process, that's very slow, very heavy-handed, less flexible, less adaptable. Self-regulation isn't subject as much to that. Vices, well, there's one big one. The fox guarding the hen house. We're relying on industry to regulate and police itself. And this is that quote from Asaf, Professor Lubin. Can we really trust these entities, these companies, these industries to regulate themselves? They're in it to make money. They want to adopt rules that'll be easy to comply with. The easiest way to say to your self-regulatory organization is, hey, We're going to adopt rules for the road. The rules for the road are we do exactly what we're currently doing. And we get to pat ourselves on the back and say, see, we're complying with our rules. That's not really meaningful. Does that mean self-regulation will fail? So this is where we start to pivot to the weird stuff of this talk. So what's going on with self-regulation? We're really asking an industry to develop its own private legal system, its set of laws, its set of enforcement mechanisms. And most of the literature on self-regulatory organization is very empirical. Much of it goes back to the SEC's early efforts to regulate the financial industry in the 1930s or so. The SEC quickly realized there's no way we can do this. We need to work with industry in order to regulate this industry. And that was the birth of things like FINRA. This was also in the era of NERA, the National Industry Reinvestment Act coming out of the Great Depression. For those who are law students and have taken administrative law, you might recognize NERA 1930s. Oh, and I could even go back to this if we're talking about NERA and 1930s, because Schechter Poultry. So there was a big issue in self-regulation, really, with agencies allowing private actors to write their own laws and regulations. The government went to the Poultry Association basically and said, hey, can you write rules? And those turned into law. And do we want private actors actually writing law? The Supreme Court said, no. Congress empowered agency to write this, needs to provide clear rules for the agency to write this. We can't delegate legislative authority. We, the Supreme Court, have real concerns about delegating legislative authority to agencies. We've got even bigger concerns about delegating that authority to private industry. This idea of developing private law is challenging. Most of the literature on self-regulation is very applied, very practical, this is what's worked before. This is what we've seen in the real world. These are examples. This is the story from FINRA. This is the story that we get from the tech sector developing DRAM technologies in the 1980s and 1990s through JDEC, a standard setting organization. Very applied, very practical. Not much legal theory. For legal theory, you need to have a law professor step in. And that's where I've been starting to think about this. Anyone know who this guy is? Dead white dude. Anyone know who this guy is? Another dead white dude. The first one, H.L.A. Hart. The second one, Lon Fuller. Two very prominent law professors in jurisprudence, the theory of the law in the 20th century. They debated whether we can have what's known as a positive law. That is a law that we create ourselves, we write ourselves, wholly independent from any sense of natural law or moral authority. So prior to the start turn of the 20th century, the standard account of the law was based in natural law. There are moral principles of what is right and wrong. We as humans are trying to craft a law, legal rules that are tending towards those objectively, externally defined moral values. That's what the law is about. Then folks like Oliver Wendell Holmes came around and said, nah, that's not what the law is about. This was the birth of the legal realist movement. Law is just a reflection of our social moral values. And this kicked off this debate over legal positivism. So Hart is the legal positivist. He was the guy who argued law is a positive human endeavor. Positive in this case means I posit something. I'm putting forth something. Not it's good, it's happy. It's a idea that I am putting into the world. So Hart said law is something that humans are putting forth into the world. There is no inherent morality in it, so long as we, as a society, adopt rules following some set of what he called meta rules. The law will be legitimate. It will be binding. We will accept the law, whatever it is. It is in principle possible that we could come up with a law that says it's cool to kill people, so long as we adopt this law using things like what he called the rule of recognition. The rule of recognition is there is a way for the subjects of the law to find out what the law is, to recognize what the law is. So long as we follow those meta rules, it's going to be cool. We as a society will accept this law, was his argument. Lon Fuller says, OMG, no, your meta rules are just the inner morality of the law. Inner morality is Fuller's term. What he is saying is, look, it matters how we adopt rules. If we adopt rules in a problematic way, if the Congress is wishy-washy with the rules, if they adopt rules that are incoherent that we can't understand, if every time you open the law books, the rules are different, even if they're adopted by these meta rules, we're going to reject them as a society. So I'm not going to read this, but he says that there are 8 different ways that the law can fail to be viewed as legitimate by the subjects. And it basically comes down to, as a society, as people, we have a sense of what law needs to be, and that's a reflection of our moral sensibilities of justice. It might not be the substantive sort of murder is bad level of morality, but it nonetheless is a morality about how we go about governing ourselves. And this debate, the Hart-Fuller debate, this was a series of articles in the 1950s and 60s, then it turned into books. If you take a jurisprudence class, half of the semester is going to be reading about this debate and arguing about this debate, then they'll bring Dworkin in and it gets even worse from there. But probably the most famous hypothetical, most famous story, it's not actually hypothetical, this is a real case, is the so-called grudge informer case. And the grudge informer case is an example that Fuller put to heart and said, okay, you think that you've given us the theory of positive law, explain this. So in the grudge informer case, World War II, Hitler comes into power, Third Reich comes into power, establishes a new set of laws in Germany that abrogates the prior law that had existed previously. One of those laws is you can't say mean things about me, Hitler. I don't like saying me, Hitler. Hitler says you cannot say mean things about Hitler. You have a woman who dislikes her husband. Her husband says mean things about Hitler, and she tells on him because she doesn't like him. So he's sent off to fight the war on the assumption he's going to die. He screws up and doesn't die. He survives. Germany loses the war. He comes back and he sues his wife for having tattled on him. And the court that hears this case holds her liable under the 1870s era German law that Hitler had taken off the books. And everyone, including Hart, says, yeah, that's obviously right. We're not going to say that Hitler's laws were right and justify this woman sending her husband, who she just didn't like, off to the front lines to die. That's wrong. And Fuller said to Hart, look, this tells us one of two things. Either your meta rules say that that law was adopted correctly, but the law is morally abhorrent, so we should reject it. Or those meta rules that you have, we're going to reject, even though Hitler followed them because they led to morally abhorrent results. Either way, you're going to reject this, Hart. You're going to reject your positivism because this is a morally abhorrent result. So this is what the debate is about. And the question that's important for me is whether there will necessarily be cases where society is going to reject legal rules regardless of how they were adopted. How does that relate to self-regulation? Well, the legal theory question of self-regulation, is it possible for us to do it right? I'm an industry. I'm Google, Meta, OpenAI, all Sam Altman, all those groups going to the White House saying, look, Mr. President, we want to work with you to establish rules for the AI road, and we're going to take primary responsibility for drafting these rules and coming up with what the rules governing AI should be. Is it possible for them to adopt a set of rules that when something goes bad, they're going to be able to go to the White House, to Congress, and say, look, we worked with you, we told you we were going to adopt these rules. We adopted rules following these meta rules, these meta procedures. Something bad happened, but you shouldn't blame us because we were trying to be good citizens. Is that possible? Or will there always be some case where potentially the self-regulatory rules we're going to reject? We're going to punish the industry. We're going to shut down companies. We're going to impose regulations. We're going to send CEOs to jail, whatever. And the Hart-Fuller debate starts to suggest the answer is maybe no. So an example. Cloudflare. Who remembers the Cloudflare snafu 2017? Not many people. Okay, so I will walk through it. It doesn't take long. Who knows what Cloudflare is? Same number of people. Okay, so Cloudflare is the internet. That's an overstatement, but Cloudflare is a big DNS infrastructure company, content delivery network company, all of this stuff. Most associated with cybersecurity. When you go to a website nowadays, if it's a larger website, your query is going to be routed through Cloudflare. And they're going to do filtering, they're going to do screening, they're going to then transfer the data that you are trying to access from the site that hosts it to their own site, a proxy site, and then send it to you. Really important for preventing things like DDoS attacks and stuff like that. Invisible infrastructure. Every one of you interacts with Cloudflare probably 1,000 times a day without knowing about it. Very important to the internet. And the CEO of Cloudflare, recognizing how important they were to the internet, had a very simple rule. We don't mess with the traffic. We are a transparent conduit. We are not in the business of deciding what content stays up, what content is good, what content is bad. That is not what we do. We are vital, critical infrastructure. So that was the rule that the company had. Until it wasn't the rule that the company had. Their terms of service, their contract said, we reserve the right to kick you off the internet. We deserve the right not to service you for whatever reason, even though the norm was of neutrality. And one day, the CEO woke up mad and decided to kick Nazis off the internet. Like literally. This is one of the headlines. Cloudflare CEO explains his emotional decision to punt the Daily Stormer and subject it to hackers. I woke up in a bad mood and decided to kick them off the internet. The Cloudflare CEO said he is deeply uncomfortable with his own decision to have his company stop protecting the Daily Stormer, a neo-Nazi website. So this is, I think, a really great analog to the Grudge Informer case. We had a rule. The terms of service say we preserve the right to kick you off the internet, to kick you off of our service, but a new rule came into place. The norms, the public commitments, the values that the Cloudflare CEO and many others in the industry have say, we don't do this. But then a set of bad actors come along, and suddenly, even though we've got this established set of really important values that we all believe are really important, we are collectively willing to throw them out the door because these are bad people. Okay, well, that's really interesting. So is it possible for us to adopt rules that we're all going to be comfortable with? I apologize for this next, how I phrased the lesson. The lesson from this: state level laws only survive moral dilemmas by reference back to the sovereign of the Hobbesian state. Okay, I've been reading too much Hobbes lately. Ultimately, we need to have some politically recognized decision maker who is outside of, who is external to the political process, who has the right to say, okay, we've got a dilemma. Society can't answer this. We're going to say this is the right rule. And in by Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan, that can be a king, it can be a dictator, it can be a Congress, it can be some council of wise people. It doesn't need to be a single person or a dictator, but it needs to be recognized by society as the moral dilemma adjudicatory body. We have to have that. Self-regulatory rules are ultimately assessed by that same sovereign. The self-regulatory organization, any self-regulatory organization necessarily exists at the sub-state level. So when these conflicts come up, it is impossible for them to be decided solely within the self-regulatory organization in a way that will be deemed legitimate by the rest of society. It's not a guarantee. It's not a promise that we can make. So I was really sad when I came to this conclusion, because when I started thinking about self-regulatory organizations and went to Lon Fuller and HLA Hart, my thinking was, okay, I'm going to be able to find a recipe, a cookbook, a formula here that self-regulatory organizations can follow that will give them this sort of legitimacy. And I came to the conclusion, I can't. It's not possible. They're always going to be subject to external, potentially existential criticism. Okay. On that note, a self-regulatory case for cybersecurity. What are we supposed to do from here? Well, this is that passage from Asaf. I'm going to rewrite this slightly. And Scott was, Professor Shackelford was at a conference with me in Boston last week, and I was commenting on a paper of his, and the end of the paper basically was, and this is complicated, Ostrom, governance of the commons sort of stuff, hand-wavy, and I told him, I was commenting on the paper, look, Scott, I've got no idea what to do with this. Your conclusion is just, it's complicated. We need to have comparative institutional governance, and who knows what's going to be. So I'm going to rewrite this quote that Asaf uses and just change it to, the reasons are complex. Yep. So yes, the reasons are complex, but in an important way. The criticism of self-governance, of self-regulation, isn't that the entities lack sufficient incentives to comply with police and punish violations of their own standards. Let me tell you, the tech industry has those incentives. They look at the market today. They look at advertisers today. They look at their insurers. They look at the White House. They look at Congress. They look at the European Union. Everyone is breathing down their back. They know that if they don't get the rules right, they're going to lose the ability to write those rules. They have every incentive to put in place rules. And that's why they're going to Congress saying, well, that's one of two reasons why. They're going to Congress saying, give us rules, work with us, help us develop standards here. Because they know that if they get this wrong, they're going to be regulated possibly out of existence. They have every incentive to set their own standards and to police them. The challenge is figuring out what those standards are and doing it in a way that will be recognized. The answer, the solution, is transitioning from a model of self-regulation to a model of co-regulation. Private efforts are going to depend upon government efforts to give them legitimacy. Now, the complexity here is just getting the government involved isn't going to give them legitimacy. Figuring out what this relationship needs to be is the hard part that we all in this room are thinking about. It's part of our project, understanding how to regulate in the cybersecurity domain. There are different ways that we can approach co-regulatory efforts. If you have a government regulator that is antagonistic towards industry, that antagonism can keep them in check. They're going to be fighting each other. That can be good. Aligned forces can rebut skepticism. If you have the White House come together with the firms developing AI technologies to say, this is important stuff to society, to the economy, to the future of the human race, we're going to work together, that can deflate a lot of the skepticism and public concern about AI and allow the technology to develop. So what we want to do is leverage each side's comparative institutional competencies, figure out what elements of government power do we need involved in this co-regulatory process. Some successes, to some extent, FINRA, the ABA, AMA models have been successes. Failures, Section 230, I think, has proven to be quite a failure on this front. I'm actually a big fan of Section 230. Section 230 is kind of like democracy, better than all the other alternatives, but it still hasn't been a great success. Jim Dempsey, some of you might be familiar with, he had a series of essays in Lawfare over the summer where he threw the idea of third-party assessments in cybersecurity under the bus, said these are not working, so a failure there. On that note, there's a blank screen because I'm out of slides, I'm done talking, and we are open for some discussion and Q&A.
So I'm not saying this because I'm biased, but I do think the context of a market in which the sovereigns are the clients who want the industry to violate any sort of internal, human rights-based regime is a little different than the markets that you're describing. And so in a situation where the various governments,
it's a great point. And I will just concede, I'm not thinking yet about the international context and domain here. Just figuring out domestically with one sovereign how this all applies and makes sense is complex enough, but you're exactly right. And of course, again, apologies to Asaf, since he's coming at this from the perspective very much the international domain, where we have an international global market for malware that's very frequently sovereigns using 0 days to violate the human rights of targets in other countries, or their own. So absolutely. Now, in many of those cases, I might say those sovereigns are illegitimate sovereigns in the Hobbesian sense, but I guess if I weren't already a target, now I am. But yeah, really great point. Yeah.
You were earlier saying, self-regulation, is it possible to do it right? When I think about self-regulation in cyber, I think, is it possible to do it well enough, quickly enough, right? That there's an urgency, there's a time factor going on.
I'll quickly just interject 100%. That's why folks who express criticism about self-regulation don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
So my question, this may be impossible to answer, but what it brings to mind is whether self-regulation or co-regulation, do we know whether they move more slowly, more quickly, at a more even pace versus that, direct government getting involved and saying, okay, here's the rules?
Yeah, so 2 levels at which I can answer that. At the first level, it definitely moves more quickly. So in terms of just getting rules out there, the government process is so slow, especially if we want binding legal rules, enforceable rules. It's relatively straightforward for the government to have policy statements and develop enforcement norms and things like that, but those are worth the paper that they're written on. And that brings me to the second point, the paper they're written on. I actually think we're doing a great job right now. Over the last decade, the development of ISACs sees federal-state cooperation, state SLTT cooperation, bringing in the private sector. I think that the right stakeholders are concerned about the right things in this area. I don't know how durable those relationships and those procedures are. I think that we as an academic community studying this need to be asking theory questions. What are the theoretical levers? What are the right comparative institutional powers that we want to leverage from each of these different actors? What is working, what makes this work, and what doesn't make this work. So that when we have a new administration come in, or we have some new companies come in, a new technology come in, they're not needing to reinvent the wheel, but even more, we can say, these are things that work. These are things that we have questions about. These are things that we know don't work. So you have a new presidential administration come in that wants to have its hands on the steering wheel more firmly. We can say, look, we understand why you want to do that, but the lessons that we've learned over the last decade are, this is the steering wheel that industry should be controlling, or this is the steering wheel that the state should be controlling, or this is a steering wheel that we should just let do whatever it's going to do, perhaps. Understanding having some more robust theory behind that, I think is going to be really important and valuable to making that case moving forward. Yeah.
So I really enjoyed the presentation. And one point I was wondering, actually echoes on Professor Marinotti's point, which is it seems to be a little bit US focused, and maybe that's based on where the technological infrastructure is located, and of course the attack where it comes from, and all of those. And I was wondering, a clarification question is, so I don't see NIST as part of kind of your analysis here. So I was just wondering, how do you phrase NIST kind of in your analysis? And the second point here is maybe just to add, when I'm thinking about self-regulation, I think about the lens from like the Chinese cybersecurity law, which is the opposite. They have a very strong regulatory approach there, and the result is because everything can be considered as cybersecurity, so then everything can be controlled by the government. Maybe would you consider that as adding another benefit of approaching self-regulation from that lens of the alternative is not the ideal alternative that you want to see how the internet becomes?
Yeah, so both are great questions. To the second one, absolutely. And kind of echoing the previous response, there are times that we don't want the government to have too strong a control on that steering wheel. And China is a great example. From the US centric perspective, we prefer, we have concerns about authoritarian inclinations here. And if industry has greater control over how the infrastructure operates and is designed, developed, et cetera, that's a check against that. So absolutely. To NIST is a fascinating, complex story. So first, NIST's role has changed over the years. On the cybersecurity front, NIST is obviously a large government agency that does a lot of stuff, not just related to cybersecurity, but their role in cybersecurity was initially very internal facing, develop controls for government IT systems. And as industry tried to implement those controls, they do. Once you get into the details of NIST, and once you're like in 53.171 level controls, it doesn't translate very well. It doesn't really address the corporate security environment. And hey, we've got ISO 27001 for that, and that's it. That's an industry developed set of standards. Very different, interesting. So understanding the purposes for which these standards work is interesting. But once NIST has moved to developing the cybersecurity framework, this is a much more general framework that I think a decade ago changed the conversation that we were having around cybersecurity in a really productive way. And the government started playing a more constructive coordination role. And I think that was really powerful. So NIST is a fascinating, understudied academically organization.
So, if I'm understanding right, you asked the question, is it possible to have self-regulation? And sort of the way to find that answer was, can it generate rules that that people will follow because of the process? But shouldn't the question for can we have self-regulation be, can they make substantively good rules and that will be followed? because doesn't, then the grudge case shows that any law, if it's bad enough, like, is subject to like people ignoring it because it's a bad law. Like, why, if it's not like possible really, if we can't imagine a law that's a process that's so good that people will accept the result regardless of its content.
Right, so the prior question that I'm really focusing on isn't can the self-regulatory organization make rules that are good? It's can they make rules that will necessarily be viewed as legitimate? What the lesson I'm taking from the grudge case example is big picture, no, we cannot make rules that will necessarily be viewed as good, but that doesn't mean that the general system is viewed as legitimate. So the Hart-Fuller debate, Hart said the court got it right by throwing out those rules, even though it means rejecting my system of positivism. I think that as a society, we were able to get to the right place. We don't need to throw out society. For self-regulation, the industry doesn't care about society at large, they care about themselves. So the question is, can the industry develop rules that are going to prevent government from regulating them out of existence? And the answer is not necessarily. No matter what those rules are, no matter what process you put forth, the government might say, look, we're mad at you. We're going to impose upon you.
So we're at time. First of all, I wanted to apologize to Gus for interrupting and apologize to the audience here. I hope everybody online was able to hear it. By the way, the next talk for the CACR speaker series is going to be Christina Liagatti on November 9th. She works for MITRE. She does AI strategy execution. Professor Hurwitz, thank you so much.
Thank you. And now you all never need to think about jurisprudential theory again.
Pleasure to meet you.
Yeah.
After our class.
Yep, thank you so much.
That was great. Love to talk to you more. I really enjoyed our conversation. I'll say my one comment. I know it's early. I needed to learn more about how you were pulling apart the code. You said you were looking at a recipe to do something. And so I didn't. And actually, I'm not saying it's not there. You said it's early.
Yep.
That's my comment.
Yep, absolutely.
Great to meet you.
Use up.
Great job, guys. I was gonna ask you how you thought of the grid. What do you think? Success or failure with like the NERC self-regulatory, like those standards being enforced after the fact by FERC, and is that led to, interesting?
I've not thought about that.
It took that shock to the system, right? The blackout to get us there. And I'm wondering that could be another interesting thing to mull, right? In this context.
Yeah, I'll want to think about that.
Yeah, for sure.
And figuring out the right levers to bring in.
Yeah.
And
I know, right?
wait, did I just rediscover Ostrom?
I know. We gotta get into the design principles.
With Professor and also Professor O'Main and Asad are both on my committee.
Oh, okay.
I'm working on section 230.
Okay. It's all there.
It's all there. And then I'm working on a paper specifically on Taiwan, depending on democracy.
Okay.
And on the internet commons. So I try to like voice God's work about the internet commons. And one thing that I want to promote about is but I've been referencing this, and I wasn't sure that I'm getting the correct. It's out there, and I mean, there's a paper from County Scholar saying that this is different from like ISO things because of how they develop the paper. But then when I was reading, I mean, listening to you, you were kind of like maybe I repeat the whole set of rules wrong, like how
So part of the challenge is there isn't a standard definition of what is self-regulation. So this is first and foremost, it's a government agency that has promulgated these rules.